Good morning. Today is Thursday, November 16th. I'd like to call this Special Darien Board of Education Finance Committee meeting to order. The first order of business is the election of a committee chairperson. I'd like to nominate John Cini.
Sorry, Mr. Graham is
logging
in.
On.
Yeah, if we could just take a pause. He's logging in right now.
Starbucks holidays have started. Probably weeks ago, a month ago, probably.
Mr. Graham isn't. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for managing it. Of course. I see his, I don't see his video, but I see his name there.
Greg, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. I turned the video on. I don't know if you can see me or not.
Well, it's 5:30 out there, so we understand.
All right. I nominated John Cini. Do I have a second? Robin Nelson. All those in favor? That is Cini, Robin. Greg, are you in favor?
Yes.
Yes. And Katie, excuse me, Katie, I didn't see you. That is unanimous. With that, I will transfer this meeting over to Mr. Cini.
Thank you, everybody. Greg, welcome to the committee. I think Robin, welcome to the committee. Katie, I can't remember.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. And that, no, I don't mean any, I can't keep track of all the committee members all the time amongst all the committees. So I appreciate that. So I guess we are ready to turn it over to Mr. Rudel to run through the October numbers.
So this is the financial report through October. We are forecasting a deficit of $614,747. This is an improvement from the previous month and more in line with the August report. Of this deficit, $675,941 is attributed to special education. In total, there was changes to the positive of $186,259. Some of the changes include there are some clubs at the high school that are not running, including the Tea Club, History Club, Cancer Awareness. So there's a savings of just over $6,000. There are salary savings from a delayed start from a middle school math teacher of $17,000. The geography B at the middle school is also not running, and that is a savings of just under $9,000. The enrichment club is not currently running at Hindley, and that is a savings of just under $3,000. We do have another custodian on the new salary schedule, and that is a savings of $11,407. We've had some turnover in building subs at Royal and Homes, and so that is a savings of $7,150. There's also some step and level savings for some clubs and councils at Homes, Royal, and Middlesex, for a total savings of $11,158. Turnover did worsen by about $1,300 for a middle school special education teacher that was hired recently. We did have some savings on the purchases of desktops for $12,600. As was approved the other day at the board meeting, the .4 special education teacher is a deficit of $23,019, and then the offset is an extended day savings of $23,019. Consultant services for special education is a positive $89,284, and that is some turnover in the RBT staffing and delayed start for those individuals as well. Out of district tuition IEP placements improved by $45,871, and that's really just due to a difference in change of placement locations. Excess cost reimbursement threshold was issued by the state, and it is slightly higher than anticipated. So that is a anticipated loss in revenue of just under $22,000. We did get a credit for our liability, auto, property, and workers' compensation from KERMA, and so that is a savings of just over $14,000. And then we had 3 students reclassified as special education in the ELP, And so that is a loss of tuition of just over $18,000. So general education RCs are positive 61,194. As we mentioned at the last meeting, we did anticipate the general education RCs would turn positive, which they did. We are anticipating that that'll actually improve in the next report, as we will have some salary savings for some vacant positions that will accrue, including the elementary Spanish positions that were talked about the other night, and a library media specialist at the high school. So again, in RC1, the big change is $6,000 in clubs that are not running. In RC3, the late start for a math teacher, that was a replacement of $17,000, and the geography B that is not running. Hinley, some clubs and councils that are not running, as well as some anticipated salary savings for another custodian on a new salary schedule. RC7, as I mentioned, vacant building sub savings and then step savings in clubs and councils. RC8 Ox Ridge, step savings from clubs and councils. RC9, savings from a vacant building sub and some step savings from clubs and councils. And then RC10, $1,790 in step savings from clubs and councils. The technology savings, as I mentioned, was a desktop was purchased at about $60 lower price point than anticipated, and so that's just over $12,000. As we had mentioned earlier, staff turnover is short of the budget by about $346,000. This is slightly higher than the previous month. As I mentioned, we did have a middle school special ed teacher that was hired slightly higher than the previous one who left. In RC24, we are showing the special education 0.4 teacher that was recently approved. Again, this will be offset by the extended day savings of the same amount. Tuition is forecasted at a deficit of $283,000. We did have some placement changes, which did turn that slightly positive. We did want to highlight that of the paras that were essentially borrowed from ELP at the beginning of the year, 2.6 of them have been returned. So there's only one left to go back. We did modify the excess cost adjustment based on the new threshold that was set by the state. The threshold was set at $108,310, which is about $349 higher than was budgeted. So relatively close to what was budgeted, but $349 across everybody that submitted is approximately $22,000. The first submission for excess cost will be submitted on December 1st. Again, ELP did have 2.6 paras returned to them. And then RC27, we do have some salary savings associated with the vacant SSO, though that individual is slated to start full-time in a couple weeks.
Okay. Since we have a couple new members, can you just briefly give a primer on excess cost and how that's how you anticipate playing out with the December update and that sort of thing?
So we have two opportunities to submit for excess cost. The first is December 1st, so in a couple of weeks, and then the second is March 1st. And so what ends up happening is we submit actual expenditures through about December 1st and then forecasted expenditures for the rest of the year. Every district in the state of Connecticut will make those submissions. The state will look at what was submitted, essentially the pot of money that was available by the state, and they will either fund it at the 85% threshold, or it'll be proportionally reduced depending on what all those submissions are. The first reimbursement to the town will come in February, typically around February 28th. And then the next final reimbursement comes at the end of May. And that next reimbursement will be based on the March 1st filings, where people have more opportunities to submit actual expenditures, and then the smaller amount of forecasted expenditures. So ideally what we'd be looking at is waiting to see in February what the state sets the reimbursement rate at. So currently we're forecasting 70%. We'll find out in February whether it ends up being 70% or slightly higher. If it's slightly higher, we should expect more revenue coming in. If it's not as high, then we won't get any additional revenue coming in. And depending on that revenue will depend on what the actual deficit is for the year.
And again, your budget now assumes 70%. So just that's baked in into his budget right now.
Is the
Rob.
change, the 70% potentially higher than that?
Robin, you have to speak into the mic as we get corrected.
Do I have to press this?
No, that one's on.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pull it closer.
The question I have is, Or is the reimbursement rate, say if it goes from 70 to maybe 75% reimbursement, is that based on, for instance, the level of the expenses that we submit in either December or March? Is it based on our actual cost experience?
So it's not necessarily our cost experience, it's every cost experience within the state of Connecticut. So everybody in the state of Connecticut, all 169 districts get to submit their expenses. The state will look at what that looks like. And right now the tiering reimbursement is 85, 88, and 91, depending on town wealth. If they have enough money at the state available within their budget, they'll fully fund it at the 85, 88, and 91. If the expenses for all the communities are higher than anticipated, then they proportionally reduce the reimbursement by tier.
So Rich, you've done a wonderful memo on this. Could you redistribute it to the newly constituted committee members? It's a neat worksheet, and as you'll see, and it's like 3-dimensional variables which go into this. So it's very difficult to budget for, and that's why I think you're going with a pretty conservative reimbursement rate, and then hopefully we don't fall below that. And hopefully we actually fall above.
So I mean, the real items to look at are what are the thresholds set at? So I had mentioned the threshold ended up being about $349 higher than anticipated. And that's really based on what our per pupil expenditure is set at by the state, what the reimbursement percentage is going to be, and then ultimately what everybody in the state submits.
Thank you.
Just one question on timing. You said that
Greg, 1 sec. Okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
you had said that February 28th was the first payment. Do you typically find out ahead of that though? Like earlier in February, you'll know what
Typically not early. In fact, it's usually like a week or so before the money
Okay,
actually
so
gets
okay,
released.
thanks.
Yeah.
And Greg, did you have a question?
I was just going to ask, this is a beginner question, I'm sure, but how do we finance the deficit? Like, do we have a revolver or a cash set aside, or how does that work?
Perfect question, because I was going to talk to Rich about, when we discuss, worrying about the deficit.
Sure.
But tell him if you could walk through what
Yep.
we're doing right now to fund this right now.
So we have an appropriation of $114.5 million. Obviously, we don't spend all $114.5 million right away. It obviously is earmarked for a variety of items within the budget. So right now, these accounts that are in a deficit, the tuition and consultant services and turnover, they stay within a deficit, and we'll track it against, cash expenditures. Typically, we don't become like, if you were to operate a deficit through at the end of the year, you don't have a deficit really until June, a cash deficit. The biggest expenditure the district has is typically out in June when teachers who elect what's called the balloon check, they can have 22 or 26 pays. Those who elect 26 pays essentially get those 4 extra pays in June. And so when we're looking at how to address the deficit that we currently have, if we were to get additional excess cost reimbursement because the reimbursement rate, let's say, is set at 75 instead of 70, we would then bring a transfer to the board to take that additional excess cost money and apply it to these categories. If we don't get any additional excess cost money, we'll pretty much know by February, then that's the opportunity to go forward and ask for an appropriation.
Yeah, and just so you know, Greg, or just to rehash it, the special appropriation would first go to the Board of Finance and potentially the RTM as well. So that's why we keep them in the loop on a monthly basis. I forward the memos to both heads of the committees that watch us on the RTM, the Education and Finance, and then Mr. Palin of the Board of Finance, the chair. So everybody's aware where we're at. The last time we ran a deficit was COVID. That was what, 21? Fiscal year 21?
Yes, fiscal year 21.
Yeah, and I mean, that was wild in terms of the swings, given the deficit we ran and then the special grants we got from the federal government mostly. So we've been here before, and we fully anticipate by basically end of February that we'll have an action plan.
I think by end of February, we'll know what excess cost is. And then depending on if we have to ask for an appropriation, the board would make that decision in March.
Yeah.
And then it would go to the Board of Finance and RTM subsequently.
Good, Greg?
Yep, all good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Go ahead, Rob.
I have some questions just on, I mean, it seems to me that we're benefiting right now, basically due to the delayed staff starts and the fact that a lot of clubs are not running. And the question I have more about the clubs is, why is that happening at the elementary schools? Why are we not running the geography B? I'm just curious what's happening now.
So the geography B, as an example, didn't run as well last year, and it's largely due to student interest. So they might end up choosing something else to run. but it has not run at least this year and last year. At the elementary level, it's a combination of either things not running, which again is student interest, or step and level savings. So similar to this teacher salary schedule where we have 15 steps, clubs have 5, so not as many. We typically budget on whatever the last advisor was making. So if the advisor last year was a step 5 and then a new advisor comes in at step 1, you get a small amount of savings.
Yeah, and we discussed a bit of the turnover at the last board meeting. I mean, that line item, even though we're slightly less turnover in terms of staff members, but the benefit from the turnover is not what we were expecting to. So and then we're also not seeing the vacancies that we saw last year as well, to the extent anyway. So that was something we discussed over the summer with the finance committee, the RTM, because we ran a nice surplus last year, and a lot of that was driven by actually the vacancies. Now that we're kind of in a more normalized environment, we're not seeing the extent of the vacancies that we saw in previous years. So, that's again the messaging that we went into this year's budget with a much tighter budget than we've seen in numerous years.
Budget control this year.
Yeah. And as Dr. Adley just mentioned, we eliminated budget control, which was typically, I know wasn't truly a reserve account, but it wasn't used to its full extent from several, if not many years. And that was a pool of capital that we used for transfers to any accounts in deficit. So that is no longer in existence.
So just one question on the turnover savings. I know you have addressed this. Is the issue that we are having to replace teachers at a higher salary level than what we typically have had in the past? Is that due to teacher shortages or just?
Yep. So it is largely due to teacher shortages, but it used to be many years ago, if a teacher retired and they were making $110,000, you'd hire a brand new teacher making $60,000, and you'd earn that $50,000 credit across the district. And now what's happening is if somebody leaves at, let's say, $110,000, you're primarily hiring somebody at $105,000. So instead of getting that $60,000 credit, you're really getting the $5,000 credit. And it's just a lack of teachers available. I mentioned at the board meeting, it used to be that you'd get a pool of new teachers. Now we're really just trading teachers with other districts in nearby areas. The turnover amount in terms of the quantity of teachers who have left is about 10 teachers less than the previous year, but it's still a number of teachers.
You don't always get the opportunity now to select a less expensive teacher because they're just as well qualified, or otherwise it's just not a.
Yeah, and one thing in the budget, and I think this is a good discussion because it's, as we talk about next year's budget, in the current contract that we signed, it's the first year of the current teacher contract. We really focused on bringing the lower end or the less experienced steps up to be more competitive with other districts. So, I'm hopeful anyway, we're hopeful that as we go into years 2 and 3, that might attract potentially some lower step teachers as well. I mean, it was the first year, so maybe we get a little more traction on those moves as well.
Rich, just a question about in RC 24 for special education, the 0.4 FTE that we talked about the last one. I'm just curious about how that amount became exact from, and I know that in the memo from the previous meeting, I think that Shirley had said that it was the lunch and prep that this would really be addressing. And it sounded like there might still be the before and after. So can you just speak to how that number aligned?
So based on the person's experience, they were slotted on a specific column and step. And so the dollar amount is based on what a 0.4 of that would be, and then prorated because they're not starting for the full school year. Obviously, they've missed September, October, and a portion of November. So that dollar amount represents a 0.4 of that person's salary for the remainder of the school year. If it ends up being that Shirley ends up needing, let's say, instead of a 0.4, like a 0.6, base because things change. It could fluctuate up, or if the person individually ends up not working as many hours as what the equivalent of a 0.4 would be, then we'd have to bring it down.
Right, thank you, I appreciate it. I guess I still don't see how, I'm just surprised that that it's an exact wash, right? Like, so.
Oh, between the offset? Yes.
Thank
So
you.
right now, we don't know who's not missing their lunch and prep yet, right? Because Shirley has to schedule it between the
Okay.
5 elementary schools. So right now, we're forecasting at an exact wash.
Okay,
It might end up being that it won't be quite an exact wash, or it could end up being even bigger savings depending on who the
okay,
teacher
so this is
Yeah.
an assumption that you're making,
Correct,
okay,
yeah.
thank
Yeah,
you.
he's just taking capital to meet what the
Okay.
demand
Correct.
of the dollars is.
So if we
not-
end up
yeah.
having a teacher at, let's say, master step 20, the savings could be actually a little bit bigger. If we have a teacher who's, let's say, on master step 5, it'll be a short.
Yeah, I get all that. Just was gonna surprise me that it came out to exactly the
No.
same amounts,
Yeah,
but that
that's
makes
his
sense
pull.
when
Yeah,
you,
that's
okay,
the
thank
the
you.
transfer out to make the
Correct.
transfer. in.
That's
Yeah.
fine. I just, thank you.
It's a good question, though.
One other question.
Yeah, go.
Okay, so then I just, I wasn't aware that there was turnover within the new paraprofessionals that were hired of those 11 RBTs. So just where are we at with that? How did this, this second
Sure.
bullet in RC 24?
Sure.
come
So it's a
about?
combination of two things. Some started a little later than anticipated.
Okay,
And then there were 2 RBTs who ended up essentially not working, either not working out or not being with the contracted company. And so
Okay.
then they had to be replaced. And so then you get that gap of time. Almost similar to when an employee leaves here and maybe you have a month where you can't actually fill the position. And it's like the equivalent of salary savings, but for a contract.
okay, and are those expected to then, like, we're looking to fill those back to the
Yeah,
11?
I think there's one that she's waiting. And I
Okay,
think
so
they
we're
have
just in-
somebody. It's just a matter of.
Okay, so we're just in a transition with that
Yes,
point.
yep.
All right, thank you.
And I'll use this opportunity to highlight Shirley's going through a lot of detail based on, Katie's suggestion that we really look at special ed and get a status update. So at our next board meeting, which is, what's the date, do we know?
I believe it's the 28th.
28th of November, 27th, or that Tuesday. So looking forward to that.
Can I, just one question, I know we'll go into more detail on the 28th, but just the favorable change in the deficit for special ed, going from 786 down to 675. What generally was driving that?
Sure. So
Positive
there's
change.
two items. There were a couple of IEP placement changes. And so based on those placement changes, the new placement is less expensive than the previous placement. And there were multiple of them, so the wash between all of them. And then a portion of it was some of that turnover within the contracted RBTs.
Okay, thank you.
And Rich, the unilateral placements, is that a net number after settlement that you're budgeting?
Yes, so
Okay.
typically on a unilateral placement, we can't claim excess costs,
Okay,
but it's a net number of all the changes.
okay, thank you. Greg, any other questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to budget transfers.
So we are recommending 2 transfers, and it's really just to address portions of a special education deficit. The first is for $63,856. We are recommending taking the salary savings from unaffiliated and nursing compensation, and then our liability, auto, and property savings. Those are kind of locked in savings, and so to move that into tuition. And then consulting services, $35,161. As we talked about previously, DSS, Darien Summer School, did perform at a higher level than anticipated. And so that's just additional revenue sitting there. And then the equipment savings from the pricing, the price point savings on the desktops that were purchased. Those would bring the general education RCs based on the current forecast to a deficit. However, I am anticipating that the next financial report, because of some salary savings associated with the elementary world language and the vacant library media specialists, will bring that back to the positive.
Okay, and you mentioned that because we do try to keep the silos from a budgeting standpoint.
Correct. I mean, ideally, we don't want the general education RCs to be in the negative, though there's been enough time that has passed that will accrue salary savings to bring that back up to the positive in the next report.
Okay, thank you. So just for the new members, we don't vote, but we give a sense of the meeting for a recommendation whether or not the board should support these transfers. I would recommend that we do support these transfers.
I just have a couple questions.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. So Rich, just coming back to a couple of things that we've discussed, but to fully comprehend. So one, in terms of these transfers and the deficit, just asking kind of about the long-term plan. Like this is addressing a portion of it, but obviously not all. So is that kind of how we're approaching it through the year, looking at where we have savings, so where we can address specific things to kind of cut down at that and rebalance?
Yep, so ideally over time, if there's small pockets of money that we know are kind of like locked in savings, and we can still balance the general education RCs, we'd like to move that into the special education RCs. And so it's kind of going to be like a piecemeal process, because at the end of the day, if you ultimately have to ask for an appropriation, it would be better to ask for an appropriation that you need than a whole amount and then give that money back at the end of the school year.
Okay, great. Thank
That
you.
is not welcomed by our partners.
Right.
In the-
So then just in the thought process of like which specific items, you're picking ones that like these two here, the tuition and those are ones that are sort of finalized as
So the
opposed to.
tuition and consult services are driving the deficit within special education. And so the accounts that I'm picking are kind of locked in savings. The board's already set unaffiliated compensation. Darien Summer School is over, so we know that revenue's there. We've purchased the desktops, right? That's not going to fluctuate. So those are the areas that I think would be at this point be recommended to take because they're not going to change. If we were to take other areas that could be more volatile, it could end up being that you end up transferring the money and then the next month or a couple months later, you have to put it back in, and that's not really.
Great,
where
I
we wanna go.
appreciate that clarification. And just one more, if I may. So then just asking about, coming back to Robin's question, noticing that difference between the September deficit for special education RCs and the October one. And thank you for addressing a couple of those things. I know you mentioned IEP placement, change, and turnover. This 99,000, almost 100,000, is this part of it too as well? Or is that 110 difference just those two things?
It's just those two things. So within the finance report, we're already showing like the Darien Summer School tuition as a positive, and so it all kind of nets together.
Okay.
We're just moving it within.
Okay, so then it would be like the November report then that would reflect this transfer, assuming it goes through the board.
Yeah, so if the board approves it now, next or 2 weeks from now.
Okay, thank you.
Just one more question. The turnover, you're saying you're anticipating additional positive.
So not,
This was different turnover.
This is a
but-
different-
this is different turnover.
Different, you mentioned the
Um,
foreign language.
So
and
we're
library
not
special-
necessarily anticipating positive turnover, but salary savings.
Salary savings.
So the difference between salary savings and turnover is permanent savings, right? Whereas salary savings is a one-time savings because the person just physically wasn't here and so they weren't getting paid.
But that would be the reason.
Correct.
You mentioned the memo, there might be some additional.
Correct. So.
That's what I was trying to
yes,
understand.
correct. Yep.
Okay. No other questions for me.
Greg, any questions on the transfers?
Nope.
And again, this goes back to your question, how we're going to meet in the deficits on an account by account basis, but sooner or later, if we can't meet those, that's when we, and it's, sometime in the spring when we go to our partners and look for a special appropriation to fill those gaps. The other option, which it's just out there, is then you start, if we don't get appropriations, then we have to stop spending in certain areas. So, because we do not want to ever go into the end of the year with a significant deficit whatsoever. I think legally we might even be bound to fill that deficit out of our own personal pockets, but.
You should pull the policy and talk a little bit maybe about the legal implications next finance committee meeting. Just so-
Or maybe a little longer. Yeah, I
A
don't
little
want to,
Just so
I want to
people
see,
are
I
aware.
would love to see February kind of play out or,
So
because
the board can end the year at a deficit.
Right.
So if the town, for whatever reason, were not willing to fund us, we would have to look at options such as freezing on mandated accounts and freezing vacant positions and things like that. That's typically rare. I would
yes,
say.
we're talking about tail risk galore right now.
Yes.
So we will not get to that point. I can assure you, or the board won't. Okay, so again, thanks for all the questions. This is great. I think it's a great primer for our new members, getting into detail. So I really appreciate it. And it's great going into next Tuesday in the discussion around special education. So, but I do recommend that we, go forth and recommend the transfers to the full board. Anybody disagree with that? Okay, so then we'll go to, I guess we're at public comment.
Good morning. Anyone in person would like to participate? If anyone online would like to participate, please use the raised hand icon. There are no raised hands.
Could I get a motion to adjourn? Katie? Robin? Greg, thank you for joining us. Maybe you get a couple extra winks. And